Hello folks, R1 here. Proteus is upon us in just a few days. It will be released on January 13th. I'm going to devote this episode to giving you a glimpse at most of what's going to be coming out at that time. Now you may wonder why I'm starting this episode with a Naga in the background. Well, that's actually a pretty good question. We'll go into that just a little bit later on, but trust me, there's a reason. We'll start with what is probably the most controversial change that's coming to us in Proteus, and that is the anticipated buff of the Recon vessels in Eve. Now, nobody's been arguing that Recon vessels didn't deserve a buff. They've been in bad need of one for a long time. But the combat recons, the ones that cannot cloak, are the controversial ones. They will now be undetectable by directional scanners. Now, the cloaked vessels have always been able to travel with a high degree of autonomy wherever they wish to go, but the combat recons got no bonuses to cloaking. And being invisible to directional scanners means that they have very nearly the same ability to ambush their intended targets as their more covert brethren that can cloak. The debate centering around this controversial change has been raging on the forums. There are many people who think that this is going to spell the end of PvE in Eve, that anyone, anywhere, can be pounced upon without any clue that they are in danger. I personally don't subscribe to that theory. If that were going to occur, it would have occurred when the rest of the Recon class got the ability to cloak. And that hasn't happened. The main reason why that hasn't happened, I'll grant you this, is because the more covert Recon vessels aren't quite as tough, and they don't have quite the attack capability. So there is that point. In fact, when this change was first proposed, as a matter of fact, when all the buffs were proposed originally, one of the options that they were including with the buffs was Tech 2 resists for all the Recon class vessels. That was very quickly withdrawn because it made them almost as dangerous in their defensive capabilities as assault cruisers. It was just a little too much. So they are going to all retain their lighter resist profile. Now, my faith in the darker side of the Eve community is without bounds. I know that there are going to be some very, very nasty tactics that are going to be conceived that are going to take advantage of the combat recon's ability to go undetected on directional scan. But do keep in mind, they still show up in local, and they still show up to probes. I imagine that the residents of our local wormholes are sweating some bullets right now, but still, they live and die by their probes, so hopefully it won't impact them too severely, and of course, they always have the same capabilities themselves to draw upon. Now, in general, the buffs that they all did receive as a class were devoted toward their basic stats, increases in power grid, CPU, making them easier to fit, making them more dangerous vessels by and large. And those changes have been pretty well received. I don't think there's anything too controversial about them. Well, the only one that is a little bit out of the ordinary as far as these buffs are concerned is for the lowly Pilgrim, which is one of my favorite vessels in Eve, but it has long suffered as being the least popular Recon and one of the least popular ships in general in Eve. Now, it suffered from having a very, very short range with its primary weapon system, if you want to call it that, its ability to NOS or nuke capacitor. But it had absolutely no bonuses to range, which made it very, very difficult to use. And it was a slow vessel anyway, so it was difficult for it to sneak up on its target unless its target was stationary. Well, Part of the buffs for all the Recons has generally been an increase in speed across the board, and that definitely helps. But they've also increased its range by giving it a bonus to its range, and in compensation have reduced its previous bonus of capacitor drain strength. So instead of at 20%, that's been reduced to 10% as far as capacitor drain strength is concerned. But it has a nice 20% bonus to range, so we'll see how that pans out. If you compare it to its counterpart, the Curse, in the Combat Recon category, those bonuses are exactly half of the bonuses the Curse receives. We'll just have to see if it's enough to compete. Personally, I think it could stand to be buffed just a little bit more, but that speed increase alone, combined with the range increase of its neutralizers and NOS, that could just put it over the top into being something to be feared again. And speaking of changes to ships, the Exequror has finally gotten a facelift. Yes, there's a new hull for 3 of the most lopsided ships in EVE. Now, I have no problem with asymmetrical hulls, but the Exequror hulls were a bit extreme. But keep in mind, it still has an asymmetrical appearance. That superstructure up there on the top right of the ship, back by the engine nacelles, that's not mirrored on the other side. So there is an asymmetrical element still in play. Now, all 3 hulls are still identical. I imagine at some point in the future they are going to have some individual tweaks and touches added to them other than the color scheme and lighting arrangement. Now, this is the Navy issue version, and that kind of looks tough. That is one of the better looking ships I've seen with the military camo pattern in place. I like it. And last but not least, the mighty Oneros, one of the better logistic ships in EVE, looking very, very swank in its new set of clothes. That looks good on that ship. And I know what you're thinking. Ranger, does that have a cool animation that goes with it? And yes it does. We'll take the basic Exequror out for a spin. You notice the engine nacelles on the back. I guess they're calling them directional thrusters. Although they don't have an animation that actually moves as the ship moves, but I guess that's okay. They're kind of offset to insinuate that they help move the ship at different angles and vectors. But as we get ready to go into warp, keep your eyes on the back of the ship. Watch those engine nacelles. Yep, nothing overly fancy. They just snap up into a more aggressive position, presumably to help boost the ship into and move through warp. Let's take a look at it from the top here as we come out of warp. And watch where the engines are attached. This looks kind of cool. There we go, coming to a halt. They turn and then snap down into their previous position. Pretty sharp. And almost as if by complete accident, we landed at an asteroid belt where we get to take a look at the new, well, I guess you would call them atmospheric effects in the belts. There's new lighting effects, dust and particle effects, debris floating everywhere. The God rays, as they're called, piercing through the dust in the belt. It really gives it a great deal of atmosphere. Now, the chunks of asteroids that you see, I'm not sure what mechanic they've used to implement them, but they have not impacted my frame rate in the slightest, nor have the dust fields that you're flying through. I was a little worried about that, but they seem to have done a great job. I had no frame rate loss whatsoever. Now, the little chunks of rock themselves, you don't bump into them. They don't bump away from you. You don't collide with them. You can pass right through them, but they're far enough apart from each other that really doesn't become obvious enough to break your immersion. Very rarely will you actually pass through a chunk of rock, but it looks great. Now, perhaps, depending on how these have been implemented, perhaps if and when tessellation is finally brought to EVE, we will see these little chunks of rock bouncing off our shields. But that will be sometime in the future, if ever. they may not have been able to implement them in a way to give them enough substance to be tessellated like that. So I'll take being able to pass through the pieces of debris if doing them a different way to allow them to bounce would cause frame rate issues or lag. I would say this is the superior choice in how to implement it. But it may not be an either-or situation. Perhaps someday we'll have both. And speaking of asteroids, the next time you're in one of the starter systems, keep an eye out for the new mining anomalies that have been brought into play. I warped into this one in Chavan, and the first thing I saw was a raven. I thought I was in the wrong place. But it turns out that there are some random objects that appear in these anomalies from time to time. The raven's supposed to be here. That crow has been abandoned by a player. Right. It's a good-looking ship, though. There are a number of bits and pieces of abandoned material here and there. A huge mining drill. There's also a abandoned mining facility. Some of the odd, weird, twisty asteroids floating here and there. And other bits and pieces of interesting things to look at for new players as they spend their time finding these anomalies that have been put in place so that they are always available for them to mine when they're first starting out. And I think that's a good idea. I mean, there have been times when you're trying to do, you are trying to do the mining tutorial, or you've just done it and you're wanting to put those new skills into play, and well, there's nothing left in the starter systems to mine. Well, now you'll always have something that you can easily find, go to, and mine to your heart's content. Now, they just have little small chunks of Veldspar floating around. Nothing that would be of interest to the Veldknot or any other experienced player, but more than enough to let a new player hone their newly found mining skills. Oh, and if you're worried that the starter systems are becoming a little bit too filled with rainbows, lollipops, and fluffy bunnies, there are other things in these little mining anomalies that will give the new EVE player a taste of things to come. Now, of course, that only skims the surface. There's a ton of other fixes and adjustments that have been made in the upcoming patch. The ongoing effort to rebalance modules goes into full swing, as well as a renaming system. They are finally adding back in some of the flavor to the module names in EVE, and I'm very happy about that. I see the need for a logical, systematic way to approach the naming of items in EVE, because it can be very confusing for the newer players, but some of the flavor text and some of the unique and descriptive names and titles that were given to some of the modules, well, it was a shame that we were losing them. Well, now they're coming back, and this is a big step in that direction. And there are also a few other minor, nice touches. Mobile scan inhibitors and mobile micro jump deployables are now only going to trigger a suspect penalty rather than a criminal penalty for shooting at them in high security space, which, well, okay, I can see that. And the scan resolution of fighters, bombers, and regular fighters has been reduced to ensure that pilots cannot gain an advantage by rapidly scooping and relaunching them. Well, we'll see how that one goes over. Well, that should just about cover the broad strokes. I think that's about everything. Oh yeah, I did promise you that there was a reason why I was showing the Naga in the background of my hangar when I first started this video. It seems that CCP has finally found the time and the resources available to go in and fix the intended animation for the Naga. Now, I'm not talking about the little dish that circles there on the left of the ship. No, its animation is something a bit more impressive than that. We're going to look at it bow on so that you get the full scope of it here. And there it goes. As it goes into warp, the two hull sections close together in the center. Now, that's just kind of cool. That's a fairly major geometry change to the ship, and I like it. The Naga's Caldari hull design, well, this has always been a very, very distinctive ship, and I'm glad that they have finally gotten the animation in place to complement it. I don't think there's another ship in EVE, including the new tactical destroyer, that has such a large section of the ship's hull involved in its warp animation. There we go. She slides apart and locks into place. Excellent. So I'm going to take the Naga on back to the station, and that does indeed wrap up this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider giving me a like or sharing the video on your favorite form of social media. And if you really liked it, you might even consider clicking the subscribe button you're going to see at the end of the video. I'll continue to do my best to give you regular updates on the accelerated release schedule that CCP has been doing such good work with the last few months. And wait a minute, is it just me, or does that look like a little kitty face? That's probably just me. I probably shouldn't have stopped at that narcotics station back in the noob system. Well, anyway, until I see you guys again, good hunting.